Hi, everybody. Let's talk really quickly about the research paper source analysis assignment that we had last week, where you were looking at James McPherson's article titled, "Who Freed the Slaves?" And I want to just quickly walk through some key points that you should have picked up on. And if you didn't, that's okay. That's why we're having this exercise. This is really just an exercise in the process that you're going to need to complete for each and every source, all 5 sources, before we get to step 2. And so what we used this particular assignment as an exercise for was kind of preparing for step 2 and step 3. Step 2 only requires that you extract all of the key information and details out of each source, okay, according to the prompt. So here, as you look at my screen, again, this is the research paper prompt. You're going to be taking these 5 sources who present a variety of arguments to answer the question, who freed the slaves? Or who deserves the most credit for emancipating the slaves? Now, you'll probably find as you read through these 5 sources that the answer to this question is actually complex. There is no single individual or entity that you can point to and say, it's only because of so-and-so that the slaves were freed. No, there were multiple factors at play. So the question really is, who deserves the most credit? Who played the most significant role in liberating the slaves, right? That's what you want to be looking for in each author's argument, where they stand on that issue. All right. So what you're going to be doing, here's your prompt again, right? You want to find the main point of each source. So in this particular assignment, you were tasked with finding McPherson's main point, his main argument. And then you want to describe in detail how each author supports their viewpoint. Okay, so what specific facts and information are they using as evidence to support their point, to support their claim or argument? Okay, now when we get to ultimately step 3 in writing your paper, because this is your research paper prompt, so when you get to step 3, you're actually going to be discussing each of these sources in detail and then comparing their various viewpoints. Who aligns with who and in what ways? And then who disagrees with who and in what ways? And then ultimately, you're going to be evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence and logic presented by each author, and then ultimately determining which one you think was the most effective and why. All right, so that's what you're doing in step 3. In step 2, you're pulling out all of the information you're going to need to accomplish that. Okay, and so you can do this in note form and in bullet point form, whatever it might be. You don't have to write out full paragraphs or a full essay. That's going to be step 3. So step 2 is extracting this key information you need. What is their main point? What specific facts and information are they presenting as evidence to support their main point? What are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? Okay, and then ultimately, again, you will determine how they match up with each other. So step 2 is more about getting that key information, those notes. What we did here in this assignment was kind of a practice run at step 2 and step 3. Right, because you had to extract all of this key information, what their main point is, what their evidence is, how effective they are. But instead of just putting it into notes, you actually had to now take those notes for this one source and then type up a summary analysis, okay, with this prompt in mind here, discussing in depth and detail their main points and their key pieces of evidence, and ultimately your assessment of how effective McPherson was. All right, so this was a practice run really at step 2, extracting all of the information, getting all of your notes together, and step 3, converting those notes into paragraph form. All right, so that was the purpose of this exercise. All right, and it's all, again, working gradually toward completing this research paper. All right, so let's talk about McPherson. And what I want to point out is that a lot of people struggle in identifying McPherson's main point because of the way he opens up his article. All right, so if you believed, if your analysis led you to believe that McPherson was arguing the self-emancipation thesis, in other words, McPherson's main point was that the slaves deserve the most credit for liberating themselves. If that's what you believe, then you're incorrect, okay? You're going to see that argument made by other authors, but that's not McPherson's main point. Okay, in fact, McPherson is arguing that Lincoln deserves the most credit for liberating the slaves. But the way that he goes about that is gradual in the beginning. He first introduces you, the reader, to the traditional narrative, or what the average person would say if asked who freed the slaves, and then this new emerging this emerging narrative among historians and sociologists that's kind of picking up steam and being more widely accepted, which is the self-emancipation thesis, that the slaves deserve the most credit for really pushing the Union officers and Union troops, and then ultimately Congress and Lincoln into action. All right, so he's presenting you the traditional narrative, followed by this new historical narrative that's starting to pick up popularity. And then he introduces you to his argument. All right, and his argument, again, is that Lincoln deserves the most credit for freeing the slaves. Now, let me show you exactly how that lays out. All right, and I'm not going to bog you down with a lot of detail here. I just want to point you at some key pieces of information in the article so you can go back, whether you got the argument right or not, you can go back and make sure that you have not only the argument correct, but also all of the evidence that you're going to need to talk about McPherson's source in detail when you get to the final paper. All right, so let's look at McPherson's article. So I'm going to click over to his article here, all right? And I want to just show you, I'm going to go between that and between some notes that I have here. All right, so the first thing that McPherson does, these are some of my notes that I took for McPherson's article. Okay, the first thing that he does is he presents the traditional narrative, or how would the average person answer the question, who freed the slaves? And his answer is, the average person would say Abraham Lincoln, right? That's the traditional narrative. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and if asked for reasons and they are able to give you reasons, they would probably point to his Emancipation Proclamation, his role in the adoption of the 13th Amendment. All right, so Emancipation Proclamation was in January 1863. It freed slaves, liberated slaves in rebellious states only. The 13th Amendment was the amendment to the Constitution that abolished slavery in the United States forever. Lincoln got the ball rolling on that. And then they would also point to his role as president of the Union and commander-in-chief of the victorious Union Army. But then he talks about how historians challenge this traditional narrative because it's a simplified answer that Lincoln freed the slaves. Really, the answer to this question is more complex. And again, this is something that not only McPherson points out, but that you'll actually see, again, as you read through all of these articles. You'll see that they just have to give nods to these other factors. It was a multifaceted, multi-causal thing, emancipation. All right, so this is what he's saying. He's saying that historians challenge the traditional narrative as being too simplistic, right? And so they say that really the answer to the question is much more complex. And they'll point to Lincoln's gradualism. In other words, he didn't immediately push for the abolition of slavery, right? In fact, he didn't immediately, claim that he was going to end slavery during his term, as president. So his gradualism, they'll point to as being something that you have to consider. It wasn't that he was just an ardent abolitionist who entered office and from day one put his foot down that slavery was no longer going to exist in the United States. That's not how it worked. It came about gradually through his policy. All right, so he's now kind of getting the reader, introducing the reader to some of the debate that's going on, right? This is exactly why we're looking at this question and looking at these sources, is to analyze these various arguments, analyze the debate around this question of who freed the slaves and synthesize that information in an essay, all right? So this is what McPherson's doing. He's introducing you, the reader, to the debate. He's saying, here's the traditional narrative. Here's why historians say that, well, it's a little too simplistic. That's kind of problematic. There's really more things to consider instead of just saying Lincoln freed the slaves. And now he shows you the opposing argument. And I call it the opposing argument because it's an argument that is in opposition to what ultimately McPherson will be arguing in his article. And this is the self-emancipation thesis. Okay, the idea that, again, the slaves, not Lincoln, were the most responsible for emancipation. All right, and he lays it out for you. Here as you look at my notes, this is from page 193 of the article. All right, so this is the very first page. He already launches into it. By flooding into Union military camps in the South, they forced the issue of emancipation on the Lincoln administration. By creating a situation in which Northern officials would either have to return them to slavery or acknowledge their freedom, these contrabands, as they came to be called, acted resolutely to place their freedom and that of their posterity, or their children and grandchildren, on the wartime agenda. All right, so the wartime agenda initially was bring the southern states that seceded back into the fold, crush this rebellion, and restore the Union. Okay, and this argument, the self-emancipation thesis, or the self-emancipation argument, is that the slaves are the ones who put abolishing slavery on the wartime agenda. And they did it by forcing the conversation, by forcing the hands of the Union officers, and then ultimately Congress and Lincoln to deal with the slaves and the issue of slavery. Like, what do we do with these slaves that escape the rebellious South and come across Union lines? What do we do with them? And then what do we do with the slaves that haven't made it yet? And then what do we do about slavery as a whole in this country? What is the outcome of slavery after the war? Do we return them as property, as had been done with fugitive slaves all the way up into the Civil War? Do we return them to their owners, their rebellious owners who claim no loyalty to no allegiance to the Union anymore? Do we still return these slaves as property to them? Right? So he's saying, here's the argument for the self-emancipation thesis, which is that slavery was not front and center on the wartime agenda until slaves began to escape the Confederacy, cross Union lines, and then place that pressure on the Union Army, on Congress, and on Lincoln. And that's what he says in the next sentence. Union officers, then Congress, and finally Lincoln decided to confiscate this human property belonging to the enemy and put it to work for the Union in the form of servants, teamsters, laborers, and eventually soldiers in Northern armies. Adam Goodhart and Manisha Sinha are going to both talk about this as well, all right? So there's a hint for you. Weighed in the scale of war, these 190,000 black soldiers and sailors, and probably a larger number of black Army laborers working behind the lines, tipped the balance in favor of Union victory. All right, so that is his summary of the self-emancipation thesis. And he talks about the role that slaves played across Confederate lines, sabotaging production on the plantations. He talks about a couple of key historians. He mentions Vincent Harding. He also mentions Barbara Fields, who, of course, has an article or a chapter in an edited book called Who Freed the Slaves? Same title as McPherson's article, right? And so he kind of lends a nod her way as being one of the historians who basically buys into the self-emancipation thesis. Okay, so this is why a lot of students get stuck believing that McPherson's argument is that the slaves freed themselves. But this is what's key, all right? On page 196, so let's go there. Okay, he's talking all about the self-emancipation thesis. And then on 196, we get to a paragraph that starts with a question. Okay, anytime you find an author, especially a historian, who poses a question, key in on it. Because this is something they're pointing your attention to. Okay, they want you to notice what they're about to say now. They're asking a question that they think needs to be answered. And so you want to key in on a question that the author is asking, because you know at the end of the day, the author is really trying to give answers to questions, not to give you a bunch of questions left unanswered, right? So if they're giving you a question, it means that this is an important question that they feel needs to be answered, and then they're going to follow that with an answer. So what is his question here? He says, how valid are these statements? What statements? Well, everything that he said up till this point, which is discussing the self-emancipation thesis. So how valid, he's saying, is the self-emancipation thesis, or are the points of evidence behind the self-emancipation thesis? Okay, so here's his answer. First, we must recognize the considerable degree of truth in the main thesis. By coming into Union lines, by withdrawing their labor from Confederate owners, by working for the Union Army and fighting as soldiers in it, slaves did play an active part in achieving their own freedom, and for that matter, in preserving the Union. Okay? So he talks about kind of the valid points behind this argument. But now look down a little bit further. Okay? He says that is all to the good. Okay, there are valid points behind the argument that the slaves played a role in their own liberation. Okay, he acknowledges that. He says that is all to the good. But by challenging the myth, okay, and a lot of these historians that argue in favor of the self-emancipation thesis, and you'll see this in Fields specifically, argue that the old traditional narrative that Lincoln came in on his white horse and freed the slaves, right? That type of idea, that it's all a myth, right? To kind of prop up this, great white leader who freed these oppressed, dark-skinned people, right? This is what a lot of people on the self-emancipation argument side say about the traditional narrative, that it's a myth that Lincoln freed the slaves. He says, by challenging the myth that Lincoln freed the slaves, proponents of the self-emancipation thesis, I'm right here, proponents of the self-emancipation thesis are in danger of creating another myth, that he had little to do with it at all, right? It may turn out upon close examination that the traditional answer to the question of who freed the slaves is closer to being the right answer than is the new and currently more fashionable answer. So in other words, he's saying, yes, there are valid points behind the self-emancipation thesis, but the problem is the way that people are arguing the self-emancipation thesis is they're arguing that the slaves freed themselves, and Lincoln did not. He had little to do with it. In fact, some argue that he even hindered the process, not helped the process. And McPherson's saying that's dangerous because that's a myth in and of itself. And really, if you dissect the evidence, you'll probably end up finding that the old traditional narrative that Lincoln played the most important role in freeing the slaves actually holds up better than the new, as he calls it, more fashionable answer that the slaves freed themselves. Okay, this is key because this here is where he's now going to give his argument on behalf of Lincoln. So how does he go into it? Well, let's look at the next paragraph. He says, first, we must ask what was the sine qua non of emancipation in the 1860s. Sine qua non is a Latin term that just means the essential ingredient, the thing that must be there, right, for something to happen. So what was an essential of emancipation? A thing that without which emancipation could not have occurred. Okay, and he says the essential condition, the one thing without which it could not have happened, was the war. All right? Now, okay, he hasn't gotten to Lincoln yet, but hang on, he's getting there. Okay? Let's jump ahead just a little bit and look at, here's another question he's asking, right, in this paragraph. What brought the war and opened that door? So first he lays out that, look, without the war, without the Civil War, there would have been no Confiscation Act, no Emancipation Proclamation, no 13th Amendment, not to mention the 14th and 15th Amendment, which were important to the pursuit of equality, of racial equality in the United States. Certainly no self-emancipation, and almost certainly no end to slavery for several more decades at least. By the way, let me point, before I jump over to this paragraph that says what brought the war and what opened that door, look what he says right here. Slavery had existed in North America for more than 2 centuries before 1861. But except for a tiny fraction of slaves who fought in the Revolution, or escaped, or bought their freedom, there had been no self-emancipation during that time. Okay, so this is him kind of taking a shot, so to speak, at the self-emancipation thesis, right? His argument is that slavery had been in the United States for 200 years, okay, but there had never been any large-scale emancipation, despite the fact that obviously the slaves did not want to be enslaved. Right, despite the fact that several tried to escape, that several bought their freedom, and a smaller amount than those who tried to escape. Some fought in the Revolution for their freedom. Some fought on the British side of the Revolution for their freedom. Despite all of this, wide-scale, large-scale emancipation had not occurred. Okay, and so he's saying every slave insurrection or insurrection conspiracy failed in the end. And in fact, on the eve of the Civil War, plantation agriculture was more profitable, slavery more entrenched, slave owners more prosperous, and the slave power more dominant within the South, if not in the nation at large, than it had ever been. Without the war, the door to freedom would have remained closed for an indeterminate length of time. Okay, so he's saying the war is absolutely essential. Self-emancipation hadn't occurred before the Civil War, so the Civil War was crucial. Okay, the sine qua non. But then he asks, but what brought about that war? And opened that door, opened that opportunity, created that opportunity for emancipation. And he says, again, here is a complex and even controversial answer. A short and simplified summary, he says, is that secession, okay, the states, the southern rebellious states leaving the Union, and the refusal of the United States government to recognize the legitimacy of that secession brought about the war. Okay, so the southern slave states seceding from the Union, and the U.S. government, the federal government, refusing to recognize that as a legitimate secession. It was because of that that the war took place. And here's his key point. In both of those issues, the southern states leaving the Union and the U.S. refusing to accept it, in both of those issues, Abraham Lincoln moves to center stage. All right? Here now you know where he stands. And the rest of his article is going to lay out exactly why Abraham Lincoln was key to a key figure in the secession, in the war, in bringing about victory, and in ultimately pushing forward governmental policy leading up to the abolition of slavery in the United States. Okay, and this is now where you're finding his evidence. Through all of these pages here, you're finding his evidence. Okay, now let me go back to my notes really quick. Okay, I want to now show you where you can just get the most well wrapped with a bow on it summary of his main point and evidence. And he gives it to you not at the beginning of his article, but at the end of his article on page 207. In fact, let's go back and look. We're on the last page of 207. It is on the last page that he gives you this nice summary. Again, kind of nicely wrapped with a bow on it, okay? It is in the last paragraph, right about dead center, starting with the word but by pronouncing slavery right here. Okay, he says, but by pronouncing slavery a moral evil that must come to an end, and then winning the presidency in 1860, provoking the South to secede, comma, that's one, okay? As a candidate, he pronounced slavery a moral evil that had to come to an end. It could no longer coexist with the ideas of freedom and democracy that had become so firmly entrenched in the United States. You could no longer justify having slavery in this country. He made that claim. He was very firm on that as a candidate. Okay, by pronouncing slavery a moral evil that must come to an end, and then winning the presidential election in 1860 that provoked the South to secede. That's when the South seceded, when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, because the South thought, here it comes. He's going to gun for us because he's so firmly anti-slavery. He said it in so many speeches that surely when he gets into office, he's going to come try to take away our slaves and our livelihood, right? So that's one, comma. By refusing to compromise on the issue of slavery's expansion or on Fort Sumter, okay? So by holding his resolve, by saying that he is not going to allow slavery to expand anymore. And this was something that scared Southern pro-slavery leaders. Okay, if slavery can't expand to the new territories, to the new states to the west that were being added to the Union, if slavery couldn't expand into those new territories and states, then what happens at the federal level? Okay, think about this. If only free soil states are added to the Union as we move further and further west toward the Pacific Ocean, all right? If just free soil states, no slave states are added, then every new representative and every new senator that comes into Congress is going to be anti-slavery. They're going to be representing a free soil state, not a slave state. And the fear of pro-slavery Southerners was, once that happens, then they're going to be able to pass a law abolishing slavery. All right, it wasn't just necessarily that Lincoln could do it. He needed Congress. And if he wasn't going to budge on slavery's expansion, he was going to stick firm that slavery could not expand. He wasn't going to take slavery away immediately from the southern states, but it couldn't expand in the West. That Lincoln stood firm on. And they thought, well, then the next thing to come is Congress is going to get packed with free soilers, and then they're going to come for our slaves. All right. So that's number two. Okay. By refusing to compromise on the issue of slavery's expansion or on Fort Sumter, to not back down in South Carolina when South Carolina, really the first state to secede, struck on a Union fort. By careful leadership and timing that kept a fragile Unionist coalition together in the first year of the war and committed it to emancipation in the second, by refusing to compromise this policy once he had adopted it, and by prosecuting the war to unconditional victory as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Liberation, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. All right, so here he's laying out essentially all of his evidence. He's laying out his main point, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and all of his evidence, okay? By pronouncing it a moral evil and causing the southern states to secede in fear that he would ultimately be the demise of their slave system, by refusing to compromise on slavery's expansion or on Fort Sumter, by being willing essentially to go to war over an attack on a Union fort, by careful leadership and timing that kept a fragile Unionist coalition together. Not all slave states seceded. All right, so some slave states decided to stay as members of the Union. And Lincoln was careful not to quickly change the rhetoric or the narrative to start talking about abolishing slavery altogether, because if he did that, he would alienate the slave states that stuck with the Union, those loyal slave states. And then they would join the Confederacy, and it would ultimately probably wreak demise for the Union as a whole. He knew he had to keep that Unionist coalition together, even though some of those states, those loyal states, were slave-owning states. And so he had to really walk this tightrope, right, of being anti-slavery and anti-slavery, expansion, anti the expansion of slavery, maybe I should word it, but not alienate these loyal slave states and just throw them into the open arms of the Confederacy, right? So he had to hold this fragile Unionist coalition together in the first year of the war and then get it to commit to emancipation in the second year of the war. All right? And this is leading up to his Emancipation Proclamation, again, which just liberated slaves in the still rebellious states. By refusing to compromise this policy once he adopted it, once he issued the Emancipation Proclamation or decided he was going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, he decided in July, he waited until July of 1862, he waited until January 1863 and used it as an ultimatum essentially. But once he had decided on this policy, he refused to back away, even though many Unionists were arguing this is a problem. This is a problem, and it's going to be hard to get people, again, in these loyal slave states to back you up. And it's going to be even harder to bring these rebellious states back into the fold now that you're emancipating their slaves or their property, right? But he stuck firm to that policy. He didn't compromise it. And then by prosecuting the war to unconditional victory as Commander-in-Chief of an Army of Liberation. In other words, by not coming to some terms of agreement with the Confederacy, okay, but instead pushing through to victory, complete and total victory that allowed the federal government of the United States to dictate the terms of the South's return. Not the South dictating the return, the terms of reconciliation, but the Union government, the federal government of the United States, getting to fully dictate the terms of how the Southern states will be brought back into the fold. That is all key to the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment being passed. These Reconstruction amendments. So as you look at this last sentence here, the end of this last paragraph that sums up McPherson's main point and his evidence, now the key is go back and find all of these pieces of evidence in his article, because those are what you'll need to discuss when you're talking about McPherson in your final paper. It's what you should have found in this exercise, in this assignment, but if you didn't, that's okay, because this is why we're doing this, to practice it, right? But this is now what you should key in on as, okay, here's where he's summing up his main point and his key pieces of evidence. Now let me go find these pieces of evidence and let me show you something. You can find those pieces of evidence. Here they are. I listed them here, right? By pronouncing slavery a moral evil. That's the first thing he says, right? Pronouncing slavery a moral evil, he covers on 197 to 199. The next one, by refusing to compromise on the issue of slavery's expansion or Fort Sumter. Where does that happen? Pages 199 to 200. Careful leadership and timing, holding that fragile unionist coalition together and then getting it to commit to emancipation, 200 to page 202. Refusing to compromise this policy once he adopted it, page 202 to page 205. Okay, and then lastly, prosecuting the war to unconditional victory as commander-in-chief, pages 205 to 207. He covers every one of these pieces of evidence that he summarizes in this last sentence of the last paragraph. All right, so this is how you need to go about these sources. If you find them asking a question, look for how they answer it. And don't just look at the beginning of an article for a main point. You got to find it through by thoroughly reading the entirety of that article, because you might find the best summary sentence, the best thesis statement, so to speak, doesn't come at the beginning. It might come all the way at the end, like McPherson's here, where the best summary of his thesis he puts into the last sentence of his article. All right, so read thoroughly, read in depth and detail. Find where they're giving you answers. Find where they're presenting facts. Look for that nice thesis statement if you can find it, either at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end. And then go back and double check and make sure, am I getting all of the pieces of evidence that I need? All of the pieces of evidence that this author is using to support their main point. Because that's going to help me really discuss this source in detail, right? And it's going to allow me to compare this source and contrast this source with the other sources that are required for this research paper. All right, so that's McPherson in a fairly large nutshell, I guess. But that's the approach that you need to take, and that careful and diligent approach that you need to take when reading all 5 of these articles. For step 2, you're going to just need to have the notes that show me that you have extracted the main point and all of these key pieces of evidence, and good notes that show page numbers and this and that, right? You don't need to write it all up in paragraph form yet, but you'll need good, strong, detailed notes from every single source. And you're also going to then, having read all of the sources, having extracted all of the key information and their main points, you're going to write up at least a first draft of an introductory paragraph that you will be using in your final paper. How you think you're going to launch into this paper, introducing your reader to the debate around this question and some of the different theses that have been presented, some of the different arguments that have been presented. So that's going to be step 2. Doesn't have to be in paragraph form as far as your notes yet. Okay, that'll be in step 3, but this kind of detailed analysis is what you'll need to show in your notes for each of the 5 sources in step 2. So hopefully this helps you make better sense of McPherson, but also better sense of this process. All right, and of course, if you have any questions at all, I'm here for you. Please feel free to reach out and ask.